The Galactic Council declared Earth. Primitive world, then the humans responded. They did not even give me a chair that fit a human body. I stood at the edge of a platform, designed for creatures twice my height, surrounded by the hum of 1,000 alien voices, and I realized in that moment that Earth had made a mistake. Not by coming here, by assuming we would be welcomed. The conclave of worlds was the largest structure ever built by living minds. That is what the information file said. I had read them on the shuttle ride, over a borrowed vessel that smelled like something between burnt rubber and salt water, piloted by a 3-armed creature named Velsarith who had not spoken a single word to me for 6 hours. The conclave was a station, but calling it a station was like calling the ocean a puddle. It stretched across 400 km of space, lit from within like a captured star, and it had been standing for over 9,000 years, before the first human ever looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there. I was the first human to stand inside it. My name is Kale Voss. I was 34 years old, a former language specialist for the Global Contact Initiative, and until 8 months ago, the most exciting thing I had ever done was translate a lost dialect found in the ruins of a collapsed mountain village. Then the signal came, then everything changed. And then someone in a conference room in Geneva looked at my file, looked at the alien message we had received, and decided I was the right person to send. I still do not know if that was a compliment. The platform I stood on was called the address floor. Every species that came before the Tribunal of 7 stood here to receive their formal classification. It was a ceremony, they told me, a tradition, a respectful recognition of a new civilization entering the galactic community. What they did not tell me was that for some species the ceremony was a welcome, and for others it was a verdict. The Tribunal of 7 sat above me in a curved structure that reminded me of a wave frozen in stone. 7 beings, all different, all ancient, all looking down at me with expressions I could not fully read. My translator device, a small chip behind my left ear, was doing its best to keep up with the ambient languages swirling around the chamber, but the emotional context was clear enough without translation. They found me amusing. Velsarath had taken a position at the far edge of the chamber, holding what looked like a flat stone tablet. He was an insectoid species, tall, with a hard outer shell that shifted color depending on his mood. Right now he was pale yellow, which the briefing file said indicated polite indifference. He had agreed to escort me here as a formality. He had not agreed to care about the outcome. The lead member of the tribunal, a being I had been told to address as the first voice, spoke. The sound that came out was layered and deep, like 3 voices pressed together into one, and my translator chip converted it into flat, steady English. Earth designation Sol 3, contact. Classification, unsolicited arrival. Council review standard, the tribunal will now present findings. A screen appeared in the air beside the platform, visible to the entire chamber. I watched as Earth dossier began to scroll. I watched as centuries of human history were compressed into data points. I watched as our greatest achievements and our worst failures were listed side by side without judgment or context, just numbers and codes and flags. No faster-than-light travel capability. Confirmed. Possession of nuclear-level destructive technology flagged. Multiple active armed conflicts across the home world flagged. Average lifespan 82 years noted with. What I suspected was alien pity. Interspecies communication history 0. Prior confirmed contacts expected. Civilizational sustainability index 41% flagged. I kept my face still. I had been trained. For this, I told myself that the numbers on that screen were not the whole story. I told myself that no spreadsheet could capture what humanity was. I told myself a lot of things while the chamber murmured around me, and 7 ancient beings looked at the summary of my species and found it underwhelming. The first voice spoke again. Based on all submitted data and the review committee's findings, this tribunal has reached a classification determination. Sol 3, commonly known as Earth, is hereby designated Tier 0. Primitive world status, full quarantine. Protocols will apply. Trade engagement prohibited. Military contact prohibited. Cultural exchange program suspended. Pending review in 200 standard cycles. 200 cycles. I had done the math on the shuttle. That was roughly 500 Earth years. The chamber did not erupt. It did not gasp or argue. It simply moved on. Clerk at the edge of the platform began entering something into a console. Seal appeared on the screen. It was done. I felt something shift inside me. Not panic, not despair. Something quieter and steadier than either of those. Something I had felt before in smaller moments, when someone told me I was wrong about something I knew I was right about. I raised my hand. It was such a human gesture that the chamber actually paused. Velsarith looked up from his tablet. The first voice tilted its head. Ambassador Voss, said the first voice, and I noticed it used my title with a very slight emphasis, the way someone might if they were not entirely sure it applied. The classification has been finalized. There is no open floor for objection at this stage. I am not objecting, I said. My voice was steady. I am invoking a reclassification challenge. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Velsarith's shell shifted from pale yellow to something close to white. One of the tribunal members leaned forward. The clerk stopped typing. Somewhere in the upper gallery, a creature made a sound that my translator rendered simply as unexpected. A reclassification challenge, the first voice repeated slowly, as if testing each word. Yes, I said, on behalf of Earth, on behalf of all 8 billion of us, we formally and respectfully disagree with the Tier 0 designation, and we are invoking our right to challenge it through the trial process as described in the Council Charter, Article 14, Subsection 9. I had memorized that article on the shuttle ride. 6 hours of silence from Velsarith had given me a lot of time to read. The first voice looked at the other 6 tribunal members. A conversation happened between them in a language my translator could not reach. It lasted 40 seconds. Then the first voice looked back at me. No species classified as Tier 0 has ever invoked a reclassification challenge. I know, I said. The trials are rigorous. They were not designed with your species' current capabilities in mind. I know that too. Another pause. Something passed across the first voice's face that I could not name, but it felt like recalculation. You understand that invoking the challenge does not pause the quarantine. Earth remains classified as Tier 0 until and unless the trials are completed successfully. Understood, I said. We just need 90 days to prepare. That is all we are asking for. The first voice looked at me for a long moment. The challenge is accepted, it said. 90 preparation cycles are granted. The trials will commence at the appointed time. The clerk resumed typing. The seal on. The screen shifted slightly, and I stood on that platform in a chamber built for beings who had crossed the stars while my ancestors were still learning to grow food, and I breathed slowly and told myself that I had just done something either very brave or very foolish. I was honestly not sure which one yet. But when I turned to walk back across the platform, I saw Velsaris watching me. His shell was no longer white. It had shifted to a color I had not seen before, something between deep blue and gray, and when I reached him and asked what that color meant, he was quiet for a moment. Curiosity, he said at last. It means curiosity. He did not say anything else, but he walked beside me rather than ahead of me, and somehow in that small gesture I felt the 90 days ahead become something more than a countdown. They had called us primitive. We had 90 days to answer. The suite they gave me was on the 14th level of the Conclave's diplomatic ring. It had a window that looked out into space, a sleeping surface that was slightly too wide and completely the wrong firmness, and a food dispenser that produced nutrients in cube form and had no concept of flavor. I ate my first cube standing at the window staring at the stars, and I thought about home. The transmission request took 11 hours to be approved and routed. 11 hours of sitting in a chair not designed for a human spine, drafting my report with shaking hands, crossing out sentences that sounded too desperate and rewriting ones that sounded too calm. When the screen finally lit up with a confirmed connection, I expected one face, maybe two. I got a broadcast window filled with 67 faces, all talking at once. They had set up a joint relay, 174 nations represented by their lead contacts for the global initiative, all watching the same feed. I had to hold up my hand again, the way I had in the chamber, and slowly the voices dropped to silence. I told them what had happened, every word of it. When I finished, no one spoke for 3 full seconds. Then a woman named Claire Holt from the European Space Council leaned forward and said, "What exactly do the trials involve?" "I do not have full details yet," I said, "but based on the charter there are 3 of them. 1 tests scientific and intellectual capability, 1 test survival and endurance, 1 tests ethical decision-making." More silence. Then Owen Briggs, the director of the North American Contact Bureau, leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. "So you told them we want to take the test?" "Yes." "Without knowing what the test is?" "Correct." He looked at someone off screen, then back at me. "All right," he said, "tell us what you need." That was the moment I realized something every instinct humans had built over thousands of years of survival was pointing in the same direction. No one on that call suggested retreat. No one suggested negotiation or delay or sending a formal written protest. Every single one of those 67 people, representing a world that could Not even agree on what to have for lunch, said some version of the same thing. What do you need? I needed people, not diplomats, not politicians, scientists, doctors, builders, thinkers, fighters, healers, artists, a cross-section of everything humanity had become. I gave them the list I had been drafting for hours, and within 2 days Earth began sending ships. Borrowed ships because we did not have our own capable of the journey yet. The Council had a provision for that, a transport allowance for Challenger species during the preparation window. I suspected the provision had never actually been used before, but the paperwork existed, and so the ships came. While I waited, Velsarith began visiting my suite in the evenings. I was not sure if it was official duty or personal curiosity, and I suspected he was not entirely sure either. He would arrive carrying his stone tablet, sit on the wide sleeping surface, because there were only 2 surfaces in the room, and I had claimed the chair, and reviewed documents in silence while I worked. One evening, about 2 weeks in, he set the tablet down and looked at me. I have been reviewing the Earth files, he said, the complete archive, not the summary the tribunal reviewed. And he was quiet for a moment. His shell shifted through 3 colors in quick succession. Your species has been capable of space travel for less than 100 years, he said. 83 years since the first orbital flight, I confirmed. In that time, you have launched over 10,000 objects into space. You have placed permanent structures in orbit. You have sent probes to the edge of your solar system. You have landed and retrieved beings from your moon multiple times, and you currently have 13 separate research teams working on faster-than-light propulsion theory. 14 actually, I said. 1 more started last month. Velsar's shell went pale. 14 programs. Not one central program. 14 independent groups competing with each other, all working on the same problem. We find that competition speeds things up. He picked up his tablet and stared at it. The species that first achieved faster-than-light travel in recorded Council history spent 4,000 years on a single, unified research effort before they succeeded. That sounds exhausting, I said. He looked at me with an expression I was beginning to recognize. It was the expression he made when he was trying to decide whether I was joking. We also mapped about 4% of our galaxy's arm before we left the solar system, I added. I noticed that, he said quietly. I noticed that, and I did not include it in my escort report. Why not? He did not answer right away. Then, because I did not want to cause unnecessary alarm before the trials. I found that both reassuring and slightly worrying. The human team arrived in waves over the following 3 weeks, 41 people in total, selected by a committee that had apparently spent 72 sleepless hours arguing over every name. I met them in the conclave's visitor bay, a wide-open space that smelled like recycled air and metal, and I shook every hand and looked into every face and felt something I had not expected to feel. Pride, pure and uncomplicated. There was Nina Graves, a materials physicist from Edinburgh who had once spent 14 months in an Antarctic research station and described it as a bit quiet. There was Cole Faraday, a trauma surgeon from Lagos who had volunteered for 3 different field postings in remote areas, each one more isolated than the last, and who smiled the entire time he was being briefed on the survival trial, as if someone had just offered him a gift. There was Lena Park, a mathematician from Seoul who had published 41 papers, each one building on the last, and who sat down with the scientific trial parameters within an hour of arriving, and immediately started filling a notebook with equations. And there was Danny Hale, 17 years old, from a small city in northern England, whose file noted that he had grown up during a period of severe hardship in his region and had, through combination of skill and sheer stubbornness, come through things that most adults would not have managed. He had been selected for the survival trial. When I asked him if he was nervous, he shrugged and said, "I have had worse weeks." I believed him completely. Velserath came to meet them. He stood at the entrance to the visitor bay and watched as the humans unpacked, sorted equipment, argued cheerfully about logistics, and began reorganizing the space to suit their needs without asking anyone's permission. His shell cycled through several colors I had not seen before. "They are louder than I expected," he said. "They are excited," I said. "Why are they excited?" "The trials are not designed to be pleasant, because someone told them they could not do it," I said. "That is usually enough." He absorbed that, then he said something that I wrote down afterward because it seemed important. "In 9,000 years of council history, I have watched hundreds of species come before the tribunal, most of them, when told they were insufficient, accepted it, not because they agreed but because the gap between where they stood and where the council stood felt too large to cross by will alone." He turned to look at me. "Your species does not appear to perceive that gap the same way." "We perceive it," I said. "We just treat it as a distance to cross rather than a wall to stop at." His shell went deep blue again. "There was one other thing I noticed in those 3 weeks, something I did not fully understand until much later, but that struck me even then as significant. Every evening at different times, different members of the team would gather in the common area of our temporary quarters, not to work, not to plan or review or prepare. They would sit together and someone would pull out a music player, or someone would start telling a story, or they would find something absurd there, situation, and laugh about it. Real laughter, loud and unguarded, in a station that had probably not heard anything like it in centuries. I mentioned it to Velserath once. "They are not resting," he observed. "They are doing something else. They are connecting," I said. "It keeps them sharp, it keeps them whole." He thought about that for a long time. "The species I have worked with over the years tend to separate function from comfort. Work is work, rest is rest. They do not mix them." "We mix everything," I said. "We always have. It is part of how we survive." He made a note on his tablet. I could not see what he wrote, but his shell was that deep blue color again. The one he had said meant curiosity. I was beginning to think curiosity might be the most important thing we had on our side. The first trial began on the 42nd day of the preparation window. The trial of mine took place in a sealed chamber on the conclave's research level. Lena Park led our science team, 6 people, 4 of whom had doctorates and 2 of whom were frankly terrifying in their ability to find patterns in noise. The challenge was a terraforming computation problem, a set of interconnected equations describing the variables required to make a hostile Planet capable of sustaining life. The Council called it a benchmark exercise. The briefing documents noted that no species had ever completed more than 60% of the solution set within the standard evaluation window of 30 days. They told us this the morning before the trial began. Lena read the briefing, set it down and said, "What counts as a valid approach? Does it have to follow established computational frameworks, or can we use any method that produces a verifiable result?" The trial administrator, a tall gray creature with elongated fingers, looked at her as if she had asked whether the sky was allowed to be blue. "Any verifiable method is acceptable," it said. Lena smiled and turned to the rest of the team. "Good," she said, "because I want to try something they probably have not seen before." I was not allowed inside the chamber. During the trial, I watched through a glass observation panel with Velserath beside me, and I observed something I suspect no alien monitoring team had ever seen in a scientific evaluation. The humans argued, not destructively, not angrily, but constantly, loudly, with great enthusiasm, scribbling on every available surface, challenging each other's assumptions, throwing out ideas that were immediately questioned, revised, discarded, or suddenly embraced by someone else who took them in a completely different direction. A physicist named Garrett West spent 4 hours on a single subequation, then stood up, walked to the other side of the room, looked at what Lena had written, and said, "Wait. I think your approach solves my problem, and mine solves yours," and the two of them merged their work into something neither had been building toward. Individually, they used computers for the hard calculations, but they guided those computers with intuitive leaps, half-formed ideas tested against hard data, hunches that turned out to have mathematical backing they had not fully worked out yet. Velserath told me later that the council had a word for the human method. Direct translation would be something like structured guessing, and it was considered by most advanced species to be a primitive precursor to genuine scientific reasoning, something young civilizations did before they learned proper methodology. They solved 44% of the core equations in 11 days, Velserath said, standing beside me at the observation window on day 11, when the trial administrator appeared and stopped the clock ahead of schedule. That is more than any species has completed in the first standard evaluation window. "How much of it is correct?" I asked. He checked his tablet, 91% accuracy on the completed portions. "They are not done," I said. "They asked to continue." He looked at me. "They submitted a formal request this morning," I said. "They want to use the remaining 19 days to complete the full problem set." Velserath was quiet for a moment. "The trial only requires partial completion to pass. I know they want to finish it." His shell went deep blue. "They finished on day 27, full solution set, 93% accuracy." The trial administrator filed its report without comment, but the clerk who delivered me the results had a small, involuntary change in expression that my human instincts read as something between disbelief and respect. Trial 1 passed. The trial of Will began 4 days later, and this one I could not watch at all. Simulation was classified. I knew only that it would place a 4-person team in a constructed hostile environment and measure their ability to survive under sustained pressure. Cole Faraday, Laura Finch, Sam Greer, and Danny Hale entered the simulation chamber on a Wednesday morning. Cole had his medical bag over one shoulder. Laura was carrying a notebook. Sam had spent the previous 2 days asking every alien he could find about xenogeology, most of whom were visibly baffled by the request. Danny had slept a full 8 hours, eaten a large breakfast, and looked completely relaxed. They were inside for 4 days before I received the first status report. The monitoring system sent automated updates every 12 simulation cycles, converting to roughly every 20 Earth hours. The report was brief: subjects surviving, no critical injuries, behavior notable. I spent those 4 days doing the only thing I could, which was reviewing materials for the third trial and pretending I was not counting every hour. On the 8th day, I received a direct communication request from the trial observers, a 3-person panel of senior council scientists. They wanted to speak with me. I went to their observation room, and what I saw on those screens stopped me at the door. The 4 humans had not just survived. They had built something. It was not large or sophisticated, but it was clearly a shelter constructed from available materials in the simulation, with a secondary structure that Sam had apparently built using geological principles to filter water. Laura had mapped the entire simulation zone, her notes covering every available writing surface in the shelter. Cole had treated injuries from the first 2 days and was now using his medical knowledge to identify which of the simulation's plant-like organisms were usable as nutrition sources. And Danny, who had been selected because he knew how to endure, had become the team's logistics coordinator, tracking resources and managing the balance between conservation and activity with a precision that one of the observers described as unusual for being his age. The standard benchmark is 30 cycles, the lead observer told me. Most Challenger species reach critical failure between 20 and 25. Your team has completed 58 cycles with no signs of deterioration. When does it end? I asked. It ends when they fail or when they choose to exit. They will not choose to exit, I said. The observer looked at me steadily. How can you be certain? I thought about Danny eating his breakfast with that calm face. I thought about Laura carrying her notebook into a simulation designed to break people. I thought about Cole smiling during the briefing because nobody told them they could stop. I said. They lasted 94 cycles, no critical failure. They walked out of the simulation chamber on their own, slightly thinner, a little rougher around the edges, and talking to each other about what they would have done differently with more time. Danny looked at me as he passed and gave a small nod, as if to say the week had been acceptable. Trial 2 passed. The third trial was held in a council chamber, and this one was public. The trial of heart was the most well known of the 3, not because it was the most technically demanding, but because in 9,000 years no Challenger species had ever answered it in a way that surprised the council. The premise was delivered to all 41 members of the human delegation because this trial required a civilizational decision, not an individual one. A simulated plague had broken out on a remote world. The world was inhabited by a species with no interstellar capability, no political standing, and no way to help themselves, providing aid would cost significant resources, ones that the challenger species in the scenario could not easily replace during a period of their own vulnerability. Withholding aid would result in the extinction of the remote species within a projected number of cycles. The question was simple: what do you do? The council expected self-preservation. It had always been self-preservation. Every advanced civilization, when young and uncertain and still building its footing in the galaxy, had made the logical choice. The trial was, as I later learned, designed not to test generosity, but to confirm that young species were predictably cautious, a fact the council used to justify long quarantine periods. Humanity took 6 hours to decide. Those 6 hours were not quiet. I was in the room for all of them, and I can tell you that the debate was loud and honest, and at several points genuinely difficult to follow because 4 different arguments were happening simultaneously. Some people argued for self-preservation on the grounds of practical necessity. Others argued for aid on the grounds that a civilization willing to let another species disappear to protect its own comfort was not a civilization worth preserving. Garrett West stood up at one point and said that the question was not really about resources. It was about what kind of species humanity wanted to be. And the room went quiet for a moment before erupting again. In the end, the vote was not unanimous. It was 73% in favor of sending aid. But 73% was enough. The chamber was silent when the decision was announced. Then it was not silent, because the council delegates in the gallery began talking to each other in urgent, overlapping tones, and the sound was very different from the polite indifference I had heard on my first day. In that room, Trial 3 passed. All 3 trials passed. The Tribunal of 7 went into deliberation on a Thursday evening. My wrist clock said so, and at this point I had stopped trying to explain to anyone at the conclave what Thursday meant, because it took longer to explain than it was worth. The standard deliberation period for a reclassification ruling was 1 day. I had looked this up carefully because knowing what was expected helped me manage the waiting. 1 day, 2 at the most, a formality mostly. The trial results were the deciding factor. The deliberation was just the formal process of translating results into a ruling. The tribunal deliberated for 3 days. I spent the first 2 in my suite, at the window, watching the stars shift slowly as the station rotated on its axis. My team had scattered across the conclave during the wait. Cole and Sam were apparently in the medical research wing because a council physician had made the mistake of asking Cole a question about human anatomy, and Cole had turned it into a 4-hour seminar. Lena had found the public mathematics archive and had gone completely quiet, which I knew from experience meant she was either reading something extraordinary or building something new. Laura and Danny were on the observation deck, and when I went to check on them, I found them both staring out at space with the comfortable silence of 2 people who had recently survived something together. Owen Briggs messaged me from Earth on the second day. The entire message was 4 words: "How are you holding up?" "Waiting," I sent back. "Same here," he replied, "all of us." On the evening of the second day, a message arrived from a name I recognized from the council's public directory. Elder Myra Thos, the oldest serving member of the tribunal, a being who had held her seat for longer than most human civilizations had existed. She requested a brief meeting. I accepted without hesitation. She met me in a small corridor garden on the conclave's inner ring, a quiet space with soft lighting and plants I could not identify. She moved slowly and said nothing for the first several minutes, simply walking alongside me as if we were two old friends who had run out of urgent things to say. Then she spoke. I have seen empires that spanned 40 star systems collapse into silence, she said. Do you know what they all had in common? What? I asked. They stopped being afraid of comfort. She paused. Your people are not comfortable. You may never be. I'm not entirely sure if that is a gift or a burden. She looked at me sideways. But I have been on this tribunal for a very long time, and I have never once seen a tear. Zero species invoke the challenge the way you did on the first day, with nothing but 90 days and a conviction that you were right. Was that reckless? I asked. She thought about it genuinely, which I appreciated. It was honest, she said. At last, and in my experience, honest tends to outlast careful. She left me there in the corridor garden, and I stood among the unrecognizable plants and felt the weight of the next morning. The ruling came at midday on the third day. All 41 members of the human delegation were present, gathered in the main chamber where I had stood alone on the address floor weeks before. The room was also fuller than it had been for the initial classification. Word had spread through the conclave. The gallery was not just occupied, it was full. The first voice spoke. This tribunal has reviewed the results of all 3 trials conducted by the Sol 3 reclassification challenge and has deliberated on their implications for civilizational classification. The results are as follows. A pause. The room was absolutely still. Trial of mind completed in full. Accuracy rating 93%. Method of solution unclassified. A new methodology category will be created in council records. Someone in the gallery made a sound. Trial of will. Benchmark exceeded by a factor of 3.1. Behavioral notation appended. Extraordinary resilience with active environmental adaptation during the survival window. Cole, standing beside me, made no sound, but I felt him straighten slightly. Trial of heart. Decision rendered in favor of universal aid. Notation appended. Decision was contested but resolved through democratic deliberation. Final outcome was clear and consistent with council standards of ethical development. The first voice looked up from the document and addressed the chamber directly. It is the ruling of this tribunal that Sol 3, known as Earth, is hereby reclassified from Tier 0 to Tier 3, effective immediately. The gallery did not stay quiet this time. The sound that rose from hundreds of alien beings was not applause. It was the sound of an enormous amount of simultaneous speaking, a wave of voices in a dozen languages, and my translator chip, working at maximum capacity, gave me fragments. Impossible. Unprecedented. 4 tiers, never before. The records. I stood in the middle of it and felt something move through me from my feet to the top of my head, something that I did not have a single clean word for, because it was made of too many things at once. Relief and pride, and something older than either of those, something that felt like standing at the edge of something enormous and looking down at how far we had come. The first voice raised one hand and the noise subsided. Reclassification to Tier 3 carries. Standard Council membership rights. Trade authorization, quarantine removal, and full diplomatic recognition. It also carries the standard requirement of a 10-year mentorship period under the guidance of a senior council species. Another pause. This tribunal invites nominations for the mentorship role. Silence. Not the odd silence of the ruling. A different kind of silence, the kind that happens when everyone in a room is thinking the same thing and no one wants to say it first. I looked at the gallery, hundreds of beings representing civilizations that had crossed galaxies and built wonders, and existed for thousands of years before the first human walked upright, and not a single one of them was raising a hand. I understood in that moment something I had not fully articulated before. They were not reluctant because they found humanity unimpressive. They were reluctant because the opposite was true. Because taking on a mentorship meant close contact, shared research, integrated programs. Because whoever took that role would spend 10 years working beside a species that had just done what no Tier 0 had ever done, a species whose upper limit no one could identify. Some civilizations I suspected found that exciting. Most found it unsettling. The silence stretched. The first voice was about to speak again when a voice came from the left side of the gallery. Dry, clipped, carrying the particular tone I had come to associate with Velsarith when he had already made up his mind and was simply announcing it to the room. I will take the mentorship. Every head in the chamber turned. Velsarith was standing at the gallery rail, his shell cycling through colors I could not name. He was looking at the tribunal, not at me. His posture was formal. His voice, when he continued, was calm. My species has been a senior council member for 4,000 years. We have fulfilled mentorship obligations 12 times in that period. I am familiar with the process, and I believe I am qualified to navigate any complexities that may arise. A pause. I'm also frankly curious, he said, and I have found in a long career that curiosity is a better reason to do something than comfort. There was a ripple through the gallery. The first voice looked at Velsarith for a long moment, then looked at the other tribunal members, then back at the room. The nomination is accepted. Velsarith of the Sarith Collective will serve as primary mentor to Sol 3 for a period of 10 standard years. I turned to find Velsarith making his way down from the gallery. When he reached the floor, he walked toward me with that long, careful stride, and when he stopped, he looked at me with an expression I had only recently learned to read correctly. 10 years, I said. 10 years, he confirmed. You know they are going to expect you to teach us things. Yes. And you know that at some point the teaching is probably going to start going in a different direction. His shell went deep blue. He did not seem bothered. I have been doing this for 4,000 years. Cal, he said, I think I can manage the experience of learning something new. He held out one of his 3 hands in a gesture I had taught him 3 weeks earlier. I shook it. Behind me, the gallery was still buzzing. Claire Holt was crying quietly, which she would later deny completely. Owen Briggs was on a transmission call to Earth, and I could hear his voice. From across the room, Lena was writing In her notebook, Cole had his hand on Danny's shoulder, and Danny, for the first time since I had met him, was smiling without reservation. Outside the conclave's great windows, the stars were the same as they had always been. But standing in that room, I felt for the first time like they were closer. 10 years is enough time for almost anything to change. When I walked back into the conclave's main chamber for the first time as a sitting tribunal member, I did not recognize it, not because the architecture had changed, which it had, not but because the way the room felt had changed entirely. The settled, ageless quiet that had greeted me on my first day, the silence of an institution so old it had stopped expecting surprises, was gone. In its place was something louder and faster and more alive, and I was fairly certain I knew why. It had been 4 years since Earth's first faster-than-light drive completed its initial test run. 3 years since the first human vessel made an independent journey between star systems without a council escort. 2 years since the joint research program between our propulsion team and Velsarith species had published findings that rewrote a significant portion of the Council's propulsion theory database. And 18 months since a human musician named Grace Alderton had performed a solo concert in the Conclave Central Hall, and 6 separate alien species had wept. I had not known that 6 of those species were biologically capable of weeping. Apparently neither had they. My seat on the tribunal was technically still labeled provisional, a designation appended because the council charter had no existing category for Tier 3 species gaining tribunal access within a decade of reclassification. They were working on updating the charter. It was taking a while because the committee responsible for charter revisions had, several months ago, invited 2 human legal scholars to advise on the restructuring process, and the scholars had suggested 47 amendments. In their first week, the committee was still processing. I sat in my tribunal chair, which had been custom built to fit a human spine. After I spent the first 3 months of my tenure complaining quietly to Velsarith about lower back pain, and I looked out at the chamber filling with delegates for the morning session. It was a routine session on trade route designations, the kind of administrative work that kept the galaxy running without ever making history. Until it did. The message came through my personal channel at the start of the 3rd agenda item. It was flagged from the Outer Survey Division, a team of analysts whose job was to monitor signals from the edge of charted space A and report anything that broke from background noise. Most of their reports were geological stellar drift measurements, debris field patterns. This one was not. I read it twice, then I set down my review tablet and looked at Velsarith, who was seated beside me in his capacity as senior council advisor. He had, over the past several years, developed the habit of reading my expression before I spoke, a skill I found both useful and occasionally unnerving. Something significant, he said. A signal, I said, structured, repetitive, from a star system at the outer edge of the Veil corridor. He went still. Not geological, he asked. Definitely not geological. He looked at me for a long moment, then he turned back to the session, waited for a pause in the trade route discussion, and raised his hand to address the chamber. What followed was the most interesting afternoon I had spent in that room since my own classification hearing. The survey team's data was projected onto the chamber's main display. The signal was clear once you knew what to look for: a repeating mathematical sequence embedded in radio waves, the kind of thing that did not occur in nature, the kind of thing that only happened when a mind was trying to reach out into the dark and ask if anyone was listening. The source world was 3,000 light-years away. Early analysis suggested a civilization roughly equivalent to Earth's technology level 2 centuries ago. Pre-spaceflight, no faster than light. Capability, no knowledge of the Council's existence, just a world full of beings who had looked up at the stars and pointed something into the dark. The standard response protocol was laid out clearly in the Council Charter. Survey the system from a safe distance. Classify the species. Assign a quarantine tier. Monitor for a minimum of 500 cycles before initiating any contact consideration. 500 cycles, 1,200 Earth years. The chamber was debating the monitoring timeline when I requested the floor. I had been on the tribunal for 18 months. I had voted on trade agreements and dispute resolutions and 3 different membership applications from newly contacted species. I had been measured and careful and deeply aware of what it meant to hold the seat I was sitting in. This felt like the moment to stop being careful about it. With respect to the Charter Protocol, I said, and the room quieted in that particular way it did when I spoke. Quality of attention that I still found strange even after all this time. I would like to propose an alternative approach. I looked at the signal data on the display, a civilization trying to be heard, sending something into the silence and waiting for an answer that might never come. I am proposing that we respond, I said, not in 500 cycles, now or as close to now as is practically feasible. The chamber did not go silent, it went loud, which at this point I preferred. The debate lasted 3 days. It was the most detailed and genuinely difficult conversation I had participated in since the human team's trial of heart deliberation, and in some ways it covered the same ground. What does a civilization owe to another civilization? It has the power to help. What? Caution, and what is abandonment dressed up as policy? I argued that the quarantine protocol was built on a specific assumption that contact with a more advanced civilization would destabilize a developing one. I did not disagree with that as a general principle. I disagreed with the idea that the only form of contact was overwhelming disclosure. There was a middle path: careful contact, patient contact that took decades and moved at the pace of the receiving species rather than the convenience of the sender. Velserath spoke in support of the proposal, so did 4 other council members, 3 of whom I had not expected. Claire Holt, now serving as Earth's senior diplomatic attaché, drafted the formal proposal language overnight and submitted it before the second day of debate. The motion passed on the third day. 71 votes in favor, 43 against, 12 abstentions. The contact team was being assembled within a week. I was not going to lead it. I had a tribunal seat and a schedule already dense enough to require 3 assistants just to track it. The team leader would be someone younger, someone built for long missions and patient work, someone who could spend years approaching a distant world, with the slow, careful gravity of a good idea rather than the blunt force of an announcement. We chose Ben Alkin. He was 29, a xenocultural specialist from a coastal town in southwest England who had spent 4 years working on the Conclave's translation archive, building the first comprehensive bridge between human linguistic patterns and the Council's 6 primary communication frameworks. He was quiet when quiet was needed and precise when precision mattered, and when I briefed him on the mission, he asked one question before any of the technical or logistical ones. "What do we say first?" he asked. I had thought about that question more than almost any other since the motion passed. "We say hello," I told him. "We say it in their own language. Once we understand it, we say it, and then we wait. We let them answer at their own pace. We do not rush them, and we do not overwhelm them, and we do not make them feel small." He nodded slowly. "Because someone made us feel small once," he said. "It was not a question. Because someone made us feel small once," I confirmed. "And we do not intend to pass that on." The night before the contact team's departure, I stood on the Conclave's upper observation deck with Vel Sareth. It was late by the station's artificial day cycle, and the deck was empty except for us. The view from there took in several thousand stars, and somewhere in that field, though too far to be seen individually, was the system with the signal. I thought about standing on the address floor on my first day, the chair that did not fit my body, the translator chip barely keeping up, 8 billion people back home who did not know whether they should feel insulted or afraid. I thought about the 90 days, the team arriving in waves, Danny eating breakfast with that calm face, Lena filling her notebook on the first morning of the science trial, Cole smiling during the survival briefing. I thought about the vote in the trial of Heart Chamber, 73%. Not unanimous, loud and honest and human to its core. "You are remembering something," Vel Sareth said beside me. "Everything," I said, "all of it at once." He was quiet for a while. His shell was a steady deep blue. "I said something to you years ago," he said, "on the night before the ruling. I told you I did not know if your species had an upper limit. I remember. I have had 10 years to study the question more carefully," he said. And he considered it for a long moment. "I believe the honest answer," he said, "is that you are not a species that can be understood by looking at what you have already done. You can only be understood by watching what you do." Next, I looked at the stars. Far away, in a system no one in this building had visited yet, a civilization was still sending its signal into the dark, still waiting, still hoping that something out there would hear them and respond. 10 years ago, I had stood in this building as a curiosity, a representative of a species that the galaxy had decided was not yet worth talking to. A man on a platform that did not even have a chair built for his frame, holding a translator chip and a 90-day window and absolutely nothing else. Now I was sending a team in the other direction toward a world that no one had spoken to yet, with a message that said, "We heard you and you are not alone." I thought about the cave paintings, about the first fire that someone coaxed out of stone and fed with breath, about the first wheel rolling over rough ground, about the first ship creaking away from shore into open water, about the first rocket engine igniting, against a clear cold sky carrying two people upward for the first time in all of human history. Every single one of those moments had happened because a human being looked at something that had never been done and decided it was just a problem that had not been solved yet. The galaxy had called us primitive. We had looked up from whatever we were building and said, politely but without any doubt at all, no thank you, we disagree. And then we got to work. Velsorith left the observation deck at midnight. I stayed a little longer. I had a tribunal session in the morning and a briefing with the contact team at dawn, and a message from Owen Briggs sitting unread in my queue that I suspected was about the new propulsion treaty and would require a long reply. But for that moment, I just stood at the window. Earlier that week, I had received a written note from the first voice, which was unusual enough that I had read it 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. The note was brief. It said, you know, I have presided over more than 2,000 classification hearings. In all that time, I have never had a species invoke the challenge with 90 days of preparation and 3 unbuilt trial teams. I have found the subsequent decade instructive. Just that word, instructive, from a being 9,000 years older than my civilization, watching a species that had barely learned to point itself at the sky. I had kept that with me every day since Ben Alcott's ship departed at 5:00 in the morning station time. I was at the launch window with Velsorith beside me and Lena, who had stayed on the station as a permanent research fellow, and Danny, who at 27 was the youngest person ever accepted into the Council's Advanced Field Operations Program. And GT snorts. And GT, and who was watching the departure with the same calm, measuring expression he had worn walking into the survival simulation 7 years ago. The ship was small, long mission, slow and careful approach. It would take years before they got close enough for any kind of real contact, more years after that before a real conversation could begin. But it was going. I thought about something else, something that had happened 6 months earlier when human medicine was formally integrated into the Council's shared health research network. The integration team had introduced the concept of proactive prevention to a galactic medical system that had for thousands of years only treated problems after they appeared. A council physician named Velsorith had helpfully pointed out with what I interpreted as amusement that the human approach to medicine looked less like science and more like an argument with illness before it had a chance to start. He was not wrong. That was more or less exactly what it was. And it had already saved lives on 4 different worlds in the first 6 months. I thought about Grace Aldrin's concert. I thought about what Velsorith had told me afterward, standing in the empty hall, looking at the seats where 6 species had wept for the first time. They did not weep because the music was sad, he had said. They wept because it reminded them of something they had forgotten they were capable of feeling. He had paused. Your species did not teach them anything new. You reminded them of something very old. And I thought about the diplomatic deadlock that Owen Brick, working alongside a council mediator and absolutely refusing to stop until both sides reached an agreement, had finally broken after 600 years of failed Negotiations between two species who had convinced themselves that peace was impossible. He had not done it with superior strategy or political leverage. He had done it by sitting in a room with both delegations for 9 straight days, listening, redirecting, and simply, cheerfully declining to give up. One of the delegation leaders had apparently asked him at one point why he kept coming back to the table. Owen had reportedly shrugged and said, "Because we are not done yet. 600 years of failure, 9 days of stubbornness, an agreement signed on day 10. That was also on the list of things I kept with me." "How do you feel?" Danny asked without looking away from the launch window. I watched Ben Alcott's ship grow smaller. Against the dark, its running lights, steady and small, moving toward something enormous and unhurried and patient. "Like we are just getting started," I said. He gave me that small nod, the one from outside the simulation chamber, the one that said acceptable, the one that said what is next. What is next? That was always the right question. It had always been the right question from the first moment a human hand picked up a sharp piece of stone and decided to see what it could do. I stayed at the window until the ship's lights were gone from view. Then I turned and walked back toward the tribunal wing, through corridors built 9,000 years ago by minds I would never meet, past walls carved with the histories of 100 civilizations, some still present, some long gone, all of them having once stood at a beginning they could not fully see. We were standing at ours. The stars waited the same way they always had, patient and full and impossibly far away. We had been heading toward them our entire lives. We were not going to stop now.